the sound any better?
Everybody here? Okay, well, while we wait, if you look very closely, you can see two of our Sea Grant slash PI-CASC staff members hiding in the forest. If you can guess who they are, you win. Any guesses? Never mind. That's Maya and Katie, who have been big supporters and volunteers at our restoration site. So thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to those of you online. This is definitely my first in-person presentation in 3 years, so it's fun to be here. Thanks to PI-CASC and Sea Grant for funding a good portion of the work we're going to present today. So I'm excited to be here with Zoe and Maile. We've been working together as part of a broader collaborative team on a community-based agroforestry restoration project in collaboration with Kākoʻo, ʻŌiwi, and Heʻeia. And we're going to be talking about our work there and more broadly today. So we will get started. Okay, so we wanted to start with this quote that kind of demonstrates our interest and commitment to biocultural approaches to restoration. So this is a quote by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She says, "Restoring land without restoring relationship is an empty exercise. It is relationship that will endure and relationship that will sustain the restored land. Therefore, reconnecting people and the landscape is as essential as reestablishing proper hydrology or cleaning up contaminants. It is medicine for the earth." So we also wanted to first introduce Puulani, which is a place that brought our team together. This is a collaboration between UH and Kākoʻo ʻiwi, and over the last 4 years or so, we've been transitioning Puulani from a non-native forest to a culturally, ecologically, and potentially economically valuable agroforest that thousands of volunteers have had an opportunity to come to, and many people have ongoing relationships with this place. We're also part of a broader team, so I'm going to highlight the students and past students next, but just to point out other co-Is on the project: Tamara Tickton and Clay Trowernick with UH, Natalie Kuroshima at Kamehameha Schools, who focused on agroforestry in her PhD and now works with KS on a variety of projects, including agroforestry projects. Kavika Winter with the Heʻeia NER, and Jade Delaveau with Natural Capital Project, who's led some of the land sea modeling work. We also have our collaborators at Kākoʻo ʻiwi. Most importantly, or who've been most involved, are Kaniko Kukea Schultz, Mahealani Botello, and Nick Rapun. And then we have a bunch of other collaborators at UH, including Susan Crow, Kiana Frank, and others, and of course the Puulani Reading Club. So, and a big part of Puulani and our broader research, and I think which is fairly unique, is that it has been very student-led. We've had some amazing past and current students who have taken really central roles in co-producing both the restoration and the research with community partners. So of course we have Zoe, who got her PhD in botany in Puulani, and some of the broader work we're going to talk about. Maile, who's undergraduate student, but has taken a lead role in the management and also works on all dimensions of the research. If you've been out there, you get to, Maile is often leads the work days. Gina McGuire, who was a Sea Grant PI-CASC fellow and took a lead on some of the statewide or PI-CASC modeling work. Tressa Hope, who just started as a Sea Grant PI-CASC fellow, who's working with Maile on the management and doing some fern restoration studies. Angel Malone was there from the beginning. She did her master's on carbon and was our top weeder, among many other things. And then Matt Kaho'ohanohano is a Heʻeia NER graduate student. And there's other students who have also worked there, but these are kind of our key team. Okay, so zooming back out to the world and Hawaii, in natural resource management, we often work in silos, right? We have agencies or departments within institutions that are in charge of agriculture. Others are in charge of forests. We have people who are in charge of terrestrial environment, people who are in charge of marine environment. In Hawaii, we have one agency in charge of water quality and another in charge of water quantity, right? We tend to be very divided, even though we know that natural resource management challenges and solutions need to be very integrated and holistic. And we also know that Indigenous management was and is much more integrated and holistic, and there's a lot of interest in moving towards more holistic management of natural resources for multiple reasons, but including that there's a lot of missed opportunities to see common goals that are sort of hidden by our silos. So one example of this are forest agricultural systems that don't fit neatly into forest agriculture silos. This is a figure from a paper that Zoe led that just shows a continuum of diversified agricultural land uses that both provide some of the benefits of diversified agriculture in terms of producing crops and other culturally and economically valuable products, but also can restore biodiversity and ecosystem services, which are also often goals of ecosystem and forest restoration. So this green box you see is kind of can fall under the umbrella of what we call agroforestry that really don't fit neatly into an agriculture or a forest silo, but are these integrated systems that really have the potential to provide multiple benefits. So our team, when we came together, we wanted to come up with a definition of agroforestry that worked for our collective experience. Understanding that agroforestry is a Western term that was coined in the 1970s, but can be this umbrella term for the suite of land uses that integrate trees and crops or other tended and harvested plant or animal species. And they range from trees in a pasture to stewarded multi-forest. So there's lots of different types of agroforestry around the world. And our group was really interested in what was going on in Hawaii today. Sorry, all the diacriticals got messed up, but we also know that agroforestry is not a new practice. In Hawaii, agroforestry systems were abundant in pre-colonial, pre-European contact. This is some work by Natalie Kurashima in her PhD, which was published in Nature Sustainability, where she showed the potential historical extent of three major types of indigenous agroforestry. In green, indigenous agriculture. And in green, you see colluvial agroforestry. And so some of her take homes are that indigenous agricultural systems likely produce food at levels of what we consume today, which is striking given that we import 85% or so of our food today. And that agroforestry likely contributed as much food as lo'i. And then also of note, she looked at which of these systems were still suitable under different climate change scenarios. And she found that about 57% of the areas modeled under the current climate remain suitable under 3 different future climate scenarios. And the majority of these are zoned agriculture or conservation. So one take home is that there is potential for restoration today. Of course, there's also many obstacles, but there is potential. At the same time, in Hawaii and globally, agroforestry systems more broadly are being seen as a nature-based climate solution or a natural climate solution. So land uses that can both help us mitigate and adapt to climate change. So from a mitigation standpoint, the trees and shrubs can sequester carbon. They also tend to be regenerative systems that can enhance or protect soil health and soil carbon, which is a really important component of ecosystem carbon. They tend to be low fertilizer and other inputs, so that has implications for greenhouse gases. And so these can be really nice complements to native forest restoration and protection, and in some areas are likely going to be more suitable for being able to incorporate local livelihoods and culturally important species. And then agroforestry systems provide important ecosystem services that are threatened by climate change, including fire risk mitigation, water retention, flood mitigation, and they produce food, and after they're established, they tend to be low labor requirements, which are all important components of helping us adapt in the face of change, including climate change. And then lastly, they can be very resilient systems, like Natalie's work showed. Many can be drought and flood resilient, or can be adapted to be more so. Many support biological and crop diversity, which have implications for resilience to pest and disease. And then these are also spaces that people come to and relate to and use, which can enhance social networks, cultural connection to place, and Indigenous and local knowledge, which are all known indicators of social resilience to climate change. And then we also have an opportunity in Hawaii's policy context. So I'm sure you're all familiar with these sustainability goals, the Aloha Plus Challenge. As a state, we've committed to be carbon neutral by 2045. Of course, this has to be involve rapid transitions from from fossil fuels, but also require some land-based interventions. We've also committed to doubling local food production by 2030. So we need to make sure that carbon-based land projects don't marginalize food production landscapes. We've committed to protect watersheds and marine ecosystems. So we want to think about biodiversity within and outside of protected areas. We've also committed to enhancing green workforce development, including INA-based jobs, and also to smart, sustainable communities, and connection to place is one of the targets and indicators. So thinking about restoring forests that are close to people is a key part of this. And then given our post-plantation landscape, we have about 40% of agricultural lands are not managed today. And if you can kind of barely see this lighter color green are just on Oʻahu, the areas that are zoned agriculture but not being actively managed. So you can think about driving out to the North Shore and those lands that are just getting taken over by invasive trees. They also are huge fire risks, fire hazards. So there is opportunity in terms of land availability. We also have a lot of forest that's not native and is considered low priority for conservation, that are potential places that could be restored. And again, these are closest to where people live. So the sum of this is that, the land availability is not the constraint. Of course, access and other structural constraints do come into play. But given these opportunities, our team was really interested in how do we support agroforestry transitions. And in particular, we were interested in community-based agroforestry like Puulani in a context of climate change. So we're going to talk about 3 components of this project. So the first, we'll talk about the Puulani restoration site, where we're measuring a suite of outcomes, including those related to climate mitigation and adaptation. We'll talk about some work that Zoe and Maile led to more broadly understand agroforestry practitioners' successes and obstacles in a changing climate, and some efforts to support exchanges and collective action. And then time dependent, we'll briefly touch on some of the statewide modeling work that we're doing to look at the potential ecosystem service benefits of agroforestry in terms of ecosystem services that are tied to real or potential incentive mechanisms. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to So to talk about, introduce and talk about our Puulani restoration. An organization called Redo. Okay, you can hear me now. Do I have to put this on? Are you okay? Okay. So we collaborate with a community-based nonprofit organization called Kākoʻo ʻŌiwi, and their mission is to perpetuate Native Hawaiian cultural and spiritual practices, and they do this through the restoration of Indigenous agriculture and stewardship of over 400 acres in Heʻeia, Oʻahu, which is pictured here. Before we started collaborating, much of their focus was on lo'i kalo,
but more than half of the acres that they steward are upland. And in the restoration plan, that was kind of the next phase, is how do we take these areas that are forested with non-native forests and restore them into native forest and agroforest, excuse me. So we came together through our mutual interest in agroforestry as a form of biocultural restoration, or the restoration of people at the same time, people's connection with place as the same time as the place. And we initiated a collaborative design process to develop a vision, goals, and research questions for a pilot agroforestry project that we could learn from and adapt on more lands in Heʻeia, but also that would provide lessons of use to folks beyond just Heʻeia. And the goals that came from our visioning meeting included both restoration and research goals. So first, to strengthen communities' connection to place and to increase the amount of plant material available for harvest, specifically for spiritual practices and cultural practices. And then also to understand what plants we plant in the beginning of restoration and how to maintain them in these early stages. So how do we really take this non-native forest and transition it into a culturally important agroforest? So we chose a small pu'u near the restored lo'i, which is pointed out here on the right, to start this project. And then Marley is going to give us an introduction to that space.
Am I close enough that you can hear? Okay.
We don't know.
Okay. Okay, so kind of to honor the name and to direct what we were going to plant initially, we chose plants that related to piko-i, which in Hawaiian thinking, some schools of Hawaiian thinking, you have three pikos. One is called i, one is called o, and one is called a. And piko-i is your spiritual connection, things that relate to akua. And so we chose plants that were important in lei, in different aha or ceremony, and in la'au lapa'au, or in medicine. And the name Puulani kind of reflects the spiritual connection in that pu'u meaning ridge relates to lani, which is heavens or anything that's above the earth. So Puulani is an elevated space, and we thought it was likely used to kilo and used as a place to kind of gather knowledge. And so our vision for Puulani and its onset was to create a place where people could share knowledge, where the community could come together and build themselves. And then also a place for people in Heʻeia, for practitioners and for just community members to come and perform ceremony. And these were our priorities when we planted. As said, we wanted the space to be accessible. And so we chose a place that had a road where kupuna and keiki LA could come and cruise. Yeah, mahalo.
Oh, really? Okay. So before we started restoring the space, we did baseline monitoring of the non-native forest that was there. And we found that this forest was characteristic of non-native wet mesic forests across Hawaii. So prior to colonization, Puulani was likely native forest or indigenous agroforest, and then it was cleared and used for pasture during the plantation era. But with the high rates of non-native invasive species here, this non-native forest began to naturally regenerate as this area was left unmanaged for the last about 70 years or so. can you hear me now? I am, ooh, yes, sweet. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our tech support. Cool, we'll continue. So like I said, we monitored the baseline, but then we also cleared by hand the non-native forest and selectively thinned the overstory. And then in a big community workday in January of 2019, we started the outplanting in a big effort with over 150 folks. Yeah. All right, a little slow here. So throughout this transition, we've been tracking different metrics of restoration success, including plant species composition and understory cover and the survival. So we've tagged all the overstory plants, carbon storage, which I'll share results of in a minute, soil health and microbes, and management costs and yields, as well as biocultural indicators, which we'll talk more about too. So we quantified the carbon storage in the non-native forest before clearing. And we found that carbon was very high, particularly for non-andesol soils, which you can see in the different pools in the figure on the right, and the spatial heterogeneity of the carbon composition down to 100 centimeters in this figure on the left. So the question is, how can we maintain this level of carbon through the transition, or what's going to happen? Will maybe we expect to see a decrease in carbon in the beginning after clearing, but are we able to regain that over time? So this will become the first complete carbon story in Hawaii for an agroforestry transition. And this is really important to inform incentives and other funding mechanisms for other folks doing this work. And then from the ecological side and the plant side, we found this really significant increase in metrics of restoration success in just the first 2 years. So we analyzed understory cover, over and mid-story survival, canopy cover, and other ecological metrics, both at baseline, like I said, and 2 years later, and found the significant change. We found lower understory cover of weed species and higher species richness of the desirable species compared to baseline. So to see this kind of significant change in such a short period of time at a site that's very characteristic of agricultural land that's unmanaged and non-native forests throughout the islands is a really important indicator of the potential for this form of restoration. Additionally, while several species of woody plants did not survive the establishment phase due to transplant shock and size at planting and these other factors that are known to affect survival during that time, most of the plants survived past the establishment phase, were resilient to a drought that we had in 2020, in the summer of 2020, and which is something that's predicted to become more frequent with climate change. While there have been many positive ecological outcomes of the restoration so far, from this side of things, there's also been a lot on the social and cultural dimensions. And so that's something that Miley is going to share with us next.
Right, so in addition to an increase in native plant people up on Puulani, we saw an increase in human people up there as well. We've had over 1,000 volunteers come to Puulani, and we've led work days in ʻŌiwi, Hawaiʻi, in English, of course. We've hosted keiki and education groups, had kupuna there, UH students, a lot of researchers, and also community from Heʻeia and beyond. We've harvested many of the plants that we planted just a little over 3 years ago, and these have been for eating. We've shared them with people that have come to volunteer. We've created lei, we've performed ceremony, had hula halau there, and then of course we've contributed to plants that are available for farm sale. We've hosted workshops there, agroforestry workshops, co-production workshops, kuʻikalo workshops, and lei making. And some of the pictures from these workshops and work days are below, and some of the things that we were able to make are pictures on here as well. And so we've had a lot of social and cultural benefits that have added to the ecological benefits that we've seen at Puulani. And this is important because we know that in the context of climate change, it's important that the social resilience aspect be considered and emphasized. And so that's been a big success here at Puulani. Of course, we've had challenges, but we've been lucky to create like an adaptive management practice that has allowed us all to collaborate even through COVID, and find a lot of success up at Puulani. Our main kind of foundation for this adaptive management is our kilo management plan. Together, we come up with a short-term plan for every season, Kovela or summer, and Ho'oilo or winter. And because we come together often, we're able to prioritize different things as the climate changes and as management people availability changes. And in response to a lot of the drought, mainly in 2020, we were able to contribute supplemental plantings, which were all propagated from the Ahupua'a of Heʻeia. And these included food plants and other important cultural plants and medicinal plants, like avocado for eating, of course, kamani, noni. Well, kamani and milo are both, kamani, milo, and ko are all hardwoods that are important for Hawaii, for Hawaiian practice, and for kalai-la'au. And then noni, ulu kukui, which are all both la'au plants and also food plants to some extent. And these are also useful ecologically because they're fast growing and they grow to become an overstory, which will hopefully help our ground covers during the next drought. We also planted a buffer or a living fence because we're having problems with ungulates. And this also helped create a barrier for weed pressure. And in addition to that, of course, we built a strong and invested community in Puulani for volunteers and to the families that come and have become family at Puulani. And then lastly, we are continuing research, and this research is adaptive in that it has responded to the challenges we've had at Puulani and also to measure the success that we've seen at Puulani. And that relates to Tressa's research in ferns. She's looking at the capacity of ferns to kind of facilitate agroforestry restoration or native forest restoration. And then we are also creating a volunteer survey that'll help us measure our success in terms of the biocultural metrics. And that's kind of all of the work we've been doing in terms of adapting our site to the changes we're seeing there. Thank you.
Oh, Miley. So there are a couple of key takeaways from this work at Puulani. First, we've seen an increase in ecological and social benefits over the last 4 years at this site that is very characteristic, like I said, of non-native wet mesic forests across the island. So this really indicates this high potential for restoration. And then the second important takeaway so far is that this type of restoration is possible despite the many challenges. As Miley discussed, these changes in rainfall patterns and drought and invasive plants and access to labor are all really important things that folks at Puulani, all of us, are facing. But through adaptive management and engaging our community through service and learning opportunities that reconnect people to place and with each other, we've been able to overcome them so far. So Puulani is just one site. So we wanted to understand who else is doing this work, what motivates them and what their challenges are, and where their successes and how they're able to persist despite these challenges. So we interviewed 38 agroforestry practitioners across Hawaii. This was in 2020, so this was virtual. And half of the groups that we were able to interview were from ʻŌiwi-led organizations. And what we found is that people's motivations are diverse, but mostly non-economic, as you can see summarized in the 3 main dimensions of themes in this figure on the left, which is similar to Kākoʻo ʻŌiwi's motivations for Puulani. But there are many obstacles, as we've been talking about, to agroforestry transitions, some that are in common with diversified agriculture, like access to land, labor, capital, and stressors that are exacerbated by climate change, like non-native species, drought, and flooding. But the practitioners we talked with also spoke about specific things to agroforestry that are challenging. And many of these related to the conflict in values between the dominant economic system and how that's focused on monetary value and short-term profits. And then their approach, which is more long-term because we're dealing with trees and forests, but also because their values are long-term. They're thinking about taking from the past and bringing into the future, and they're speaking in generations. Like, how does this, we're planting for our keikis keiki. And so we also found through this work that who can persist despite these obstacles, because again, these interviews were done with only people who are already practicing agroforestry. So for somehow they're dealing with the obstacles. And what rose to the top in themes in that was the ability to self-fund and to write grants. So being able to access these resources that are not on the site and use that to maintain the sites was really important. But also, and as a part of that, people who kākoʻo or support them, if you don't have that money, using your community to support you. So through this work in particular, we found that Oʻiwi-led organizations practicing agroforestry really express this need for more opportunities to connect with each other and to kākoʻo each other. So that leads us to now, as a follow-up to this work, we wrote a proposal and received Sea Grant funding to host a series of gatherings of agroforestry practitioners in partnership with Kamehameha schools. And so far we've engaged 15 Oʻiwi-led organizations from 4 islands in an in-person gathering and also virtual pauhana every month since April. And there's been tremendous outcomes and engagement so far. After our first in-person gathering at Waipaw Foundation on Kauai, 100% of the survey respondents said that the most useful part of the gathering was their ability to network and build pilina with each other. And then we've also heard from them since in our pauhana discussions that they have implemented management practices already that they learned from each other. So we're now planning the next exchange in October, which will focus on climate change adaptation, some of the discussions, as well as financial sustainability, which is in response to participant surveys and the interviews that we did initially. And we have one more funding to host one more gathering next spring. But another important component of exchange between practitioners that was mentioned in the research interviews and has since kept resurfacing in our gatherings with Hawaiʻi practitioners is to exchange with practitioners in other Pacific islands. And this is particularly because so much of the indigenous and traditional knowledge of how to steward these agroforestry systems in Hawaiʻi has been lost, and there aren't as many systems that are still intact. And so being able to experience those traditional systems elsewhere is a really important key that people brought up in the interviews to success. So another one of our next steps is creating opportunities for that kind of exchange here in Hawaiʻi and in other Pacific islands between groups. So we're now actively looking for funding. And importantly, we see this as a potential area of collaboration with PI-CASC. And Leah, I think that brings us to you.
Oh. Right, pass it back and forth. Okay, so we're gonna zoom back out now again. So as Zoe and Maile talked about, there's agroforestry being practiced across Hawaii, different types of agroforestry. The kind of broad type we've engaged with the most is this multi-story agroforestry with Indigenous-led organizations or Hawaiian-led organizations. So one thing we wanted to do as a team was to kind of have the sort of future visioning exercise of, okay, where could you do this restoration across the state if you didn't have some of these obstacles? So Gina McGuire, who was a PI-CASC Sea Grant Fellow, led this work thinking about, okay, where would it make sense to do this given biophysical parameters as well as land tenure parameters. So she looked at areas that are those unmanaged agricultural lands and non-native forest lands that fell into some of the biophysical constraints that Natalie used in her modeling of agroforestry systems. And using the interviews that Zoe and Miley did, we came up with a list of representative species in dry, wet, and mesic agroforestry types so that we could then use those to start to model some of these potential ecosystem services or societal benefits that could come if you were to expand this restoration in these lands that are available. So we focused on kind of 3 general ecosystem services, and these are ones that are tied to real or potential incentives. So could be types of payments for ecosystem services programs, given that, as Zoe and Miley talked about, these are really systems that provide many benefits to the farm and to broader society, but are really can struggle financially. There's not necessarily ways for short-term financial gains, but thinking about ways that we can help to collectively finance these projects is important. So we looked at, we're looking at carbon, Mauka to Makai connections due to the potential link to the Marine 30 by 30 program, and then watershed payments related to groundwater recharge. So this is a work in progress. So I'm just kind of showing you a little snapshot. So Gina McGuire has been leading the carbon component. So using those species lists that we came up with estimates of potential above ground carbon benefits. And these were very comparable to the above ground carbon in native forest. So that was cool to see. And then soil carbon is super important, and you can have more carbon in your soil than above ground, particularly in some soil types like andisols. But we don't really have the information at all to model what an agroforestry transition would potentially do to soil carbon in Hawaii. So Gina, working with Susan Crow and others, we came up with a method to estimate the likelihood of change and the directional change. And then this will be combined with above ground carbon. So you can look at, okay, where on the landscape are you most likely to get a benefit for carbon? And just to add here that there are, Kamehameha schools and the state are interested in doing carbon projects. And this is partly to really try to add agroforestry to the table of options in doing these projects, because otherwise they tend to get overlooked. Jade Delaveau is leading also some work linking agroforestry restoration to coral reefs and fisheries through a land-sea modeling framework. So that's a work in progress. And then we're also doing groundwater recharge. So we'll end up with these, maps of potential benefits that we can start to get at, okay, if you restore here, here's what the benefits might be, and can we tie that into these broader incentive programs? All right, so we presented a lot today. Thanks for your attention. And I know these kind of span scales. So we have a few take homes from this ongoing work, and then we're excited to hear from you if you have suggestions, ideas, whatever. So our first take home is that, responding to climate change is an opportunity to support more sustainable and equitable landscapes. Carbon projects have wreaked havoc in many parts of the world. And so in thinking about how do we do projects that can sequester carbon, but also provide multiple benefits and create a Hawaii that benefits people more broadly is a real opportunity. And I think this is true for land-based carbon projects, for sea level rise response, all kinds of things. So if we think about it as more of an opportunity in addition to a challenge, I think that's an exciting way to frame it. And then as Zoe talked about, some of her work and our broader work has shown that there really is, ecologically and with the support of lots of community, high potential for restoration of these fallow agricultural and non-native forest lands, which we have a lot of here. And then many groups are engaged already. So I think as a broader society, we need to figure out ways to support their work and help to remove obstacles to stewardship success. But the motivations and the knowledge and the commitment are there. And then lastly, as Zoe and Miley talked about, and we're super grateful to Sea Grant, and I think PI-CASC is also funding these exchanges. They've been really fun, and it's really powerful to see how that you know, gets people excited and thinking about additional things that can be done. You know, we see this with the Hui Malama Local I'a and many networks, how powerful they've been. So we've been really excited about the agroforestry exchanges so far. You know, there's a clear need and excitement around a Pacific-wide exchange. For those of you who have gone to other Pacific islands, agroforestry systems are abundant. You know, everywhere you go, it feels like an agroforest. So, and, you know, as Zoe was saying, this seems like it could be a really cool collaboration with PI-CASC. We had a pre-proposal that I missed up the deadline for. I thought it was 5 p.m. Hawaii time, but it was 5 p.m. Eastern time. But if folks are interested in that, we'd love to talk about potential opportunities. So last, just want to thank all of our funders. You know, our current funders are Sea Grant and PI-CASC, but we've gotten a bunch of funding from some other organizations. Zoe had a National Science Foundation fellowship for her work. And then come out to Puulani anytime. I think a lot of you here have been. But as a plug, this Saturday, Maile is leading a natural dye workshop at Puulani at 9:30 to 12. If you want to come, I'm not technologically savvy enough to use these little things, but it basically gets you to a Google form, like makes me a grandma. But we can send you the Google form or that if you want. And please feel free to reach out. And again, sorry about the diacriticals got mixed up. I don't know how that happened since it was Google Slides, but we didn't put question marks where Okina should be. Okay, thank you everybody. So you guys want to come back up and we'll take any questions. Hello? Oh, Noah, can you hear us?
Oh, now I can. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. She was saying, go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was wondering about how you guys quantified the above ground carbon in, the potential agroforestry. Just because we've been working on a carbon model for breadfruit specifically, and the published allometry for tropical trees is hugely variable, like 20-fold variable. And as we work to kind of quantify breadfruit carbon, we're finding it's way at the lower end of that huge range of that's predicted by allometry. So anyway, just wondering how you guys were quantifying above ground carbon storage in these systems.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. So we use the SHAV equation, the generalized tropical tree equation, and came up with estimates of like a range of DBH and height. So yeah, there's huge uncertainty associated with it, but that's very cool that you're doing the work with Ulu, and that's part of what we're doing with the ecosystem service modeling is kind of pointing out the gaps that we have. So that's a clear gap for sure.
Nice, thank you.
And if you can repeat your question, or I can do my best to repeat Dylan's question. I'm just going to do word after word. Go ahead.
So the question is, what is the single most important obstacle or thing that we can do to increase restoration through agroforestry? Yeah. Whoa. Yeah. Miley, did you
I
want to
don't
say?
know. I'm just wondering.
Miley's question was, who is the we that we can do? So yeah, that's an interesting thought of like the scale. So certainly for us, part of our work is at Puulani. So being able to reconnect like individually with some kind of space and contribute to restoration. But I guess broadly more at, like the structural level, which I think is maybe where your question was getting at. It's hard because you can't pick out any single obstacle from the others because they're interrelated when you look at the structural types of obstacles. So like land access and access to capital kind of go hand in hand. But I definitely say from the folks that we've talked with that secure land tenure is definitely like a foundational concern for a lot of people. And even some of the folks that we did talk with who were practicing agroforestry in 2020 have lost land access and or lost capital, and so are no longer able to do that. And sometimes it's not just like, oh, lost, like our contract ended, but it's that suite of obstacles. So that make farming in general really hard here in terms of access to labor and capital and land. So yeah, I guess, I mean, I could talk a lot more about that, but do you guys have anything else you want to add? Leah, the Pacific Wide Exchange would be the number one thing we can. But it's true, like there's these structural issues, and then there's also the component of like these systems take a lot of knowledge to run and to manage. So you think about, you know, an average farmer maybe has a few, like our diversified crop farmers maybe have like a couple of tree crops and some vegetables, and they have their set market streams, their markets. But for these people that we have been working with, they're growing upwards of 10, 15 different species that are all harvest. Many of them are native and not your traditional like commodity or your even specialty crop, but they're native plants that are harvested for cultural use. And so, yeah, that can be really, really challenging, the knowledge that goes into that. And that's where the getting people together to talk with each other can be really useful, and like the Pacific Exchange. Thanks for the question.
Stop sharing the screen, and we can also see the audience as well. I didn't want to miss what you were talking about. There are a few more questions online. I know I just said new share or pause share. We have questions. I can relay this next question. Jesse is curious if you assess food abundance, food security, or the potential impact agroforestry has towards food systems. I can repeat that one more time. Jesse is curious if you have assessed food abundance, food security, or the potential impact agroforestry has towards food systems.
We haven't done that really. I mean, we're planning to, with those representative species mixes, come up with estimates, but Natalie Kirshima did do that with her work we showed earlier. And there's many others working on that, including Noah Lincoln and others who are on the call. So, but yeah, that's a super interesting and important question. We are tracking what yields we have at Puulani.
Good job to the Zoomers. Everyone is great here too. Question from Jason. Are there any agroforestry projects located on conservation lands in Hawaii? In conservation lands.
Conservation zone lines. Yes. Yeah, I can't think of who on the top of my head right now, but yeah, DOFA, I guess, the folks in Punalu'u, Kahalu'u. Yeah, there are.
There are.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Anything else in the room?
Yeah.
I had a question in terms of, obviously UH Mānoa is not a forest, but in terms of the landscaping, and the idea we do have so much space here, are there ongoing efforts? What are some areas of success? Where are lots of areas for potential of creating this integrative space to bring people together and connection, not necessarily in a forest, but in this context on campus?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if you stroll through, I'm gonna block on which garden, maybe there's 2 of them on campus where they already have like what you might consider agroforestry, a mixed system. But also we're really lucky that the university campus is a designated arboretum and like tree. And I'm gonna forget Noveo Kai. She is a former botany graduate student, and she's doing amazing work to bring back native plants onto campus and to really engage community in that way. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential, and she's the person to talk to about it.
There's a Kākoʻo, right?
Yeah.
Campus.
Yeah.
You got a lot of head nodding over here.
Yeah, okay. Awesome. Okay. 2 more minutes remaining. I'm going ahead and we'll close up. If you'll stick around in case anyone wants to come. For those online, we're gonna close out the chat room, but there will be a survey. Please fill out that survey if you have the time. Next month is our Slice of PI-CASC Seminar on Tuesday, November 1st at noon Hawaii time, where Kirsten Olson will, with the UH Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Management, will be talking with us about examining how ridge to reef governance in Palau can enhance coastal food security in a changing climate. Registration information will be sent out, so stay tuned.
Visit the website.
Visit the website, sign up for our Pandanus newsletter, all good things. Looking forward to next month. Thank you all for joining us today.
And think about coming and joining us in person next time for free lunch.
Everyone got to see some of the food. And thank you all for being patient as we are still entering into this hybrid space. We really do want to make this accessible for folks, and we are working through the bugs. So thank you all for your patience. Appreciate it. And thank you so much to Leah and to Miley and to Zoe. One more round of applause. Have some drinks. Yep. Thank you all.
Everybody.
Mahalo.